Forests change, and they change rapidly and sometimes drastically, even from year to year. That change, in many respects, is part of how they work, and we need it to happen. The problem that we have is through time, if we've tried to remove those agents of change from the forest, and in doing so, we make them more prone to catastrophic change. And disturbance is either in the form of fire, we got lots of that in the past few years, but also in the form of insects. And the mountain pine beetle, for example, caused this change that I'm talking about, this disturbance, to about 18 million hectares. From the perspective of the total amount of dead trees, absolutely the biggest biotic disturbance we've seen in modern history around the world.
I'd like to introduce our audience to Allan. Allan's been a big influence in my life, was actually the person that was at the airport when I arrived in Canada with a big smile and welcomed me into his research group at the University of British Columbia. I'd like to welcome you to the podcast, Allan, and just wanted to learn more about your career, your research as an entomologist, as a landscape level ecologist, share your experience and your career with our audience.
Oh, thanks, Ant. It's really a thrill to see you again. It's been way too long, but just love the opportunity to catch up and chat about forest entomology, for sure.
Yeah. I think part of this process in starting a podcast is teaching our audience and maybe teaching the broader audience about forestry, and not just about the logs being cut in the woods and the mills, the logs being processed at the mills, but the research behind that industry,
right,
and the academia and what really goes into that. So tell us about your journey and how you got into forest entomology as a researcher at UBC, and you now you have been there for 16 years at UBC, running a large group of graduate students, and you have a large budget for research. So tell us about your journey and how you got into that.
Yeah, it's a funny one looking back, because as we've talked about, doors open, doors close, opportunities arise. You don't necessarily plan it, but you just wind up where you are. And so looking back, it's kind of interesting. But I grew up in a forestry-based town, and so forestry was always a part of sort of my upbringing and my focus. And I had forestry-based jobs, as a kid growing up, pulp mill, on a high-lead logging show, all those sorts of things. But I went off out of high school to UBC, in fact, to be an engineer, and that didn't work out. So after a year off school and some more experiences actually in the forest industry for a logging company, I went back to school and became a biologist, actually, Simon Fraser University. The interesting thing was, while I was pursuing that degree in biology, I got really interested in animals, animal behavior, animal ecology, and these sorts of things. And it just so happened I was wandering around the hallways looking for a summer job, and I bumped into the forest entomologist, John Borden, at Simon Fraser University. And he said, "What are you doing for the summer?" And I said, "I don't know. You tell me." And he said, "Well, why don't you come work for me?" And the funny thing is he asked me at the time if I knew anything about the mountain pine beetle. And it is funny because I have these memories of being a young child, 12 years old perhaps, when my dad would take myself, my brother and mom up to the Chilcotin Plateau, and we would spend our summers in a tiny little cabin on the Chilcotin Plateau next to Chilcotin Lake. And I'd spend time hiking in the woods, and I would see these crazy trees that were being attacked by the mountain pine beetle. It was the beginning of the previous big outbreak, not the current one. Yeah. So that was in the 70s. And so I mentioned that to John, and he said, "Well, you're just the guy for me." So that's where really the hook began for me to become interested in these sorts of things. I worked for him for a summer, and at the end of that summer, he said, "Well, work for me for the school year." I did that. And at the end of that, he says, "Well, I have no room for you in my lab, but you're going to go to New Brunswick." Because he knew a professor who was just getting started in New Brunswick and was looking for graduate students. And kind of like how you and I hooked up, same sort of thing. And I called this guy in New Brunswick and said, "Are you taking students?" And he said, "Yep, come on out." So I moved out there and essentially started a master's, which turned into a PhD. And from there, I worked on things like defoliators in spruce forests in New Brunswick. From there, I actually moved. I was offered a job into the Canadian Forest Service, and it was a kind of a funny time because at the time it was the economy wasn't doing well. It was the early 90s. There weren't many jobs in academia. In fact, there was none. And there's very few in other sorts of venues as well. But I did get an offer to move to St. John's, Newfoundland, where I went for about 5 years and took a job as a research scientist. And then towards the end of the 90s, there was a big shakeup. There was a downsizing in the Canadian Forest Service. The lab I was in was closed, and I wound up in Victoria. And I worked in Victoria for about 12 years. And it was there that I began working again with mountain pine beetle. It was just coming back on the scene. It was becoming an issue. The outbreak was getting started. And I was just the guy to step into that just by happenstance. So I worked with the mountain pine beetle throughout my time with the Canadian Forest Service. I was in the Pacific Forestry Centre for 12 full years. And then UBC knocked on my door and I said, why not? So I took the job at UBC and I've been there for the past 16. And the mountain pine beetle has really dominated a lot of that, but a lot of other really cool things have come across my desk as well. Yeah.
From a basic level, like for the non-scientists and the non-forestry professionals, can you break down the basic sort of premise of your research in entomology?
Right. It's a really good question, and it's the answer to that sort of begins with I think a general perception on the part of just the public at large is that forests just sort of are, and they sort of exist in one sort of state and they don't change. But forests change, and they change rapidly and sometimes drastically, even from year to year. That change, in many respects, is part of how they work, and we need it to happen. The problem that we have is through time, if we've tried to remove those agents of change from the forest, and in doing so, we make them more prone to catastrophic change. Those changes are driven by disturbance. And disturbance is either in the form of fire. We got lots of that in the past few years, but also in the form of insects. And the mountain pine beetle, for example, caused this change that I'm talking about, this disturbance, to about 18 million hectares, of the forests in Western Canada. It was no small thing. So change is really critical, as I said, to these ecosystems. They don't stay the way they are unless they're occasionally reset by disturbance. The problem that we have in this day and age is that climate and climate change is affecting the way in which this change itself is happening. And that's where I come in and where this form of research comes in, because we need to understand what this change means, how big it's going to be, how it will affect our forest, how it affects our forest industry, how it affects the communities that are embedded within these forests, because to let it go willy-nilly on its own isn't quite a functional thing to do.
Yeah. For the viewers at large, the mountain pine beetle epidemic that happened in British Columbia, correct me if I'm wrong, was 2005, really?
No, actually, got going about 1999. Really got started, yeah.
To this point, and again, it's been a while since I've looked at my master's research, but it was the largest landscape level disturbance, one of the largest landscape level disturbances in the world, and certainly in North America to occur over that period of time, right?
Yeah. So from the perspective of the total amount of dead trees, absolutely the biggest biotic disturbance that I think we've seen in modern history around the world. There have been disturbances that are more extensive in terms of the areas of forest that they've affected, but those sorts of things like a defoliator, like the eastern spruce budworm, don't necessarily kill trees to the degree that something like the mountain pine beetle does. So yeah, it's the biggest natural biotic disturbance event that we've had.
Would you say during your journey and your career that mountain pine beetle has been sort of a defining part of your career?
Yeah. It's been the focus of where I've gone with my research. Has been a focus of what I've done and all the things that I've done with it. During my time as a federal scientist, it became such a big thing because at its peak, it was causing the mortality of up to 10 million hectares of trees at its peak. And that was a big deal. And in fact, so big that we even showed that it was causing impacts in terms of carbon emissions to the atmosphere that were capable of causing additional warming. In fact, we showed that its impacts were equivalent to as much as 5 years of emissions from the transportation sector for all of Canada, just in a single year. So it was a big deal, and it meant that it got lots of attention. It got lots of airplay, and indeed it became the focus of a lot of political things, both locally, provincially, federally, and even in my role as a research scientist internationally. I would speak to the UN about these sorts of things, the EU, and I would be advising governments, which was an interesting place to be as a scientist, because a lot of what I was attempting to do was to help, for example, a provincial minister responsible for forests to deal with what was coming, to help them moderate the impacts to their mills, to their communities, and so on and so forth. So from there, I went into the academic position that I currently hold, and it just really rolled in a way that meant that these bigger picture questions, these big landscape level sorts of ecological things became just a real big focus of what I was doing.
And as a part of that role, you received quite a lot of media attention. So you're on TV, interviews.
Yeah.
How was that?
The media stuff was interesting. It was challenging. It was stressful. It was all of those things. It was a good place to be if you were careful with how you would deliver your messaging, because I was attempting at the time to make people understand a very complicated thing.
Yeah.
And there was lots of preconceptions and misconceptions about how it worked and what we should have been doing. And so a lot of times, there was, just as a for instance, there was the perception that the mountain pine beetle outbreak began in northern Tweedsmuir Park.
Yeah.
And that it spread from there. And the misperception that developed from that one was that we should have gone into the park with all the feller bunchers we could find and just nuke the park. And so, what we showed through some research, some landscape level research, was that actually the outbreak was a consequence of a correlated increase everywhere. So you could have done something here, but you still would have been up to your armpits in beetles because it was growing everywhere. The population was growing everywhere. So that type of messaging is not the kind of thing where you can just simply say, let's talk about the Moran effect and what it means to the beetle populations. You sort of have to be able to break that down and make people understand that some of these complex phenomena are still relevant to them and understandable and meaningful too when it comes to making proper resource management decisions. So it was a challenge, yeah. But I did enjoy it because, there were times when I could actually listen to a politician speaking to the issue and using some of my words, right? So, when I'm trying to tell them that a certain thing is an ecologically and an economically sound thing to do based upon the science, and then hear them repeat that out into the public sphere, it was really, really gratifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the big question that I'm sure a lot of people would like to know from your point of view is where are we now? We've gone through this huge landscape level disturbance. We've rushed in there and got a lot of the wood harvested, pumped through a lot of the big mills in British Columbia.
Yeah.
And then now a lot of it, just wasn't able to get rid of, and now it's decaying and dead on the ground.
Yeah.
The thought is that fuel and that wood on the ground is exacerbating wildfire.
Yeah.
Is that accurate, or where are we kind of at with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's such a spatially dependent thing. So, the idea that trees are dead and falling over and rotting, absolutely true over a large area. But go up to the sort of the cold, dry areas of the Chilcotin and note that those dead trees stand, and they stand hardened for a long time and remain viable for quite some time to harvest. But you're right. I mean, a lot of these things that are coming down, even the dead trees that remain standing, are potentially fuels for fires. And a lot of people have been trying to draw the link between fuels created by the mountain pine beetle and subsequent fires. And oh boy, it's just an equal number of studies that say yes and an equal number that say no.
Yeah.
And in part, I think it's just the way we're asking the question, because if you talk to anybody fighting a fire, if they happen to be in a place where there's been a lot of beetle kill, they'll tell you that fire is way worse than it would be elsewhere. So I think there is an impact. I think the impact is significant, but it's not the same thing everywhere. And so the question, if it's asked in a slightly different way, I think we would have different answers to that might actually sway that 50-50 sort of split on the role of beetle-killed trees in terms of fire exacerbation.
Yeah. So if we, sort of think about the mountain pine beetle landscape level disturbance, and how does that relate? Well, I guess if we look back, like it could relate to forest management, what we knew then.
Yeah.
But what about now? How do we relate that disturbance to to the management practices that we should be putting in place across British Columbia and Alberta, today.
Yeah. The mountain pine beetle gives us a really hard lesson because there are two basic ingredients for an event like what we experienced through the past 20 years. The first is that you have to have climatic conditions that favor the survival of all these animals. Because don't forget, the mountain pine beetle is the size of a grain of rice, but it's a complex animal that does complex things. So you have to have conditions that allow it to survive. But just surviving is only one half of the equation. The other half is you have to have a lot of food for it. For the second ingredient is a lot of food. And what we did is we made those two ingredients much greater than they would have been otherwise. The first is that, we've got a warming environment, we've got climate change, which has made for milder winters to improve the overwintering survival of the beetle, but it's also made for warmer summers, which help them develop sort of in the way that they need to develop. And on top of that, over much of the interior, prior to, the recent years, we pretty much took fire out of the system. Yes, we've got record-breaking fires in the last 5 years or so, but prior to that, we had almost removed all of the wildfire from our pine-dominated forests. And the mountain pine beetle likes old trees. So you take fire out of the system, you do that well for 50, 60, 70 years, you're going to grow a lot of old pine, which means that you have a whack of food for a beetle like the mountain pine beetle. And as a result, we did some work years ago on this, about 20 years ago. We found that at the start of the outbreak, there was over 3 times as much mature pine as there would have been under a normal disturbance regime if fire had been let to go in its regular way. So we just sort of took the pendulum and we gave it a big shove and made the amplitude of those swings way greater. So now we had this massive outbreak, which means that it goes back again with huge areas of forest reset that are themselves potentially prone to beetle again in 60 or 70 years.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing is like, are we going to learn? Like, I think that maybe there's a gap between academia and this is one of my questions as well, is how do you perceive that gap in what we've learned? We've said basically there was too much pine that is all the same age, and the mountain pine beetle came and we destroyed that forest, and now in 60 or 70 years from now, are we going to have the same problem if we don't manage it properly, and if academia and forest management don't talk properly? Is that going to reoccur?
Potentially. It's something that I've referred to as an ecological echo, right? Where something happened and then the recovery is going to allow it to happen again and potentially again, unless you break that cycle. The key going forward, and this is becoming more and more apparent, I think, not just in an academic context, but also in a forest management context, is that future sustainability for our forestry is going to be dependent upon diversifying and diversity itself. So you can't have a sea of even-aged pine. That's going to provide, something, an opportunity to be a big problem. Maybe it's a beetle, maybe it's fire. It could be all of those things. So making for more diverse landscapes, in the example of fire, for example, if we're talking about that, if you have a landscape that's got some breaks in it, maybe with trembling aspen, then the potential of that fire carrying through that landscape is reduced because there's a nice green break to get it back on the ground to slow it down again. So that sort of diversity is what we need to start thinking about. And what climate change is starting to force upon us is the need for that, because suddenly a species or a population of trees may no longer be viable in a certain area, in which case we're going to have to encourage other species or other populations of trees into that area, which hopefully itself will start encouraging diversification over the landscape.
Yeah, I think the mountain pine beetle has the mountain pine beetle was a defining part of my research, and the reason that I came to Canada and studied under your supervision and really enjoyed that time learning about landscape level disturbance, and part of the motivation behind this podcast series is to open those lines of communication between academia and forest management, and just to create more awareness in the industry. And let's shift focus a little bit here and talk about something a little bit closer to home for those people that have visited Vancouver and the lovely Stanley Park. We have an expert entomologist, someone that's been recognized as an expert in the field. So what happened in Stanley Park?
Stanley Park is, I'll get into the details of what happened momentarily, but it's a really good example of how public perception and nature kind of disconnect at times, because we saw the problem. By that meaning we, just you and I and everybody else, we saw the problem long after the problem had been finished effectively. And so Stanley Park suffered tremendous amounts of mortality to its western hemlock trees that were inflicted by a little inchworm, the hemlock looper. And they call it a looper because it just moves along like, a little inchworm. It is an inchworm. And its favorite food is western hemlock. It'll eat a few other things, but it loves western hemlock, and its populations can get really big really fast. And when they do, they can completely strip trees. So what happened was the population had been growing. It got quite large, in fact, up in the Vancouver water supply, where people weren't really noticing things. And at one point, when the looper had finished its development towards the late summer and produced a pile of moths, they all got blown down across into Stanley Park. And there they were, suddenly in a sea of a lot of big old hemlocks, and they laid their eggs, and their larvae proceeded to defoliate those trees. And they did so dramatically that they caused the trees to die in just a couple of years. That's the point when we started to notice things. So that's what I mean. We were 2 or 3 years into the process before we noticed the trees were unhappy, and by then there's nothing we could do about it. Yeah. All right. So the populations were big enough and defoliating things so severely that those trees couldn't tolerate it. They died quite quickly. And I've been through the park a few times and had a look, and you're hard pressed to find a living western hemlock, even small ones in that park now. It's just been completely chewed over him.
Yeah, and I was downtown Vancouver for the Truck Loggers Conference last year or the year before, and as I drove through the park, there's a tiger cat forwarder in the park, and they're doing salvage logging, right? So it was a polarizing debate about a public debate about whether we should log the trees, salvage log the trees, leave the trees. Yeah. Is it a safety concern?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I remember receiving multiple calls from various Stanley Park sort of interest groups trying to get me to provide them the information that they shouldn't be in there with the felling crews and doing anything about it, that the trees would recover. And I had to explain that once a hemlock tree is totally defoliated, it's not going to recover. And further to that, those trees, hemlock in particular, they decay quickly and they fall down quickly. And the question that I always push back to those groups, and I do it now even when I teach, and we use sort of Stanley Park as an example, is what's the park for? Right? So, and it's not an easy question to answer, because is the park there for recreation, for wedding photographs, for casual strolls along a path amongst the forests? Okay, sure, absolutely, I can buy that. Or is it there, as so many of our sort of provincial national parks are there for the conservation of ecological processes, for diversity, for these sorts of things? That's a harder sell, because it's a little island in a very urbanized area. So maybe that's less of a thing. That said, hemlock is a wonderful food for a lot of bugs, and it often is chewed down and dies very quickly and is replaced very quickly through succession. So I usually ended that conversation by asking people if they could remember what the park looked like in 2006, right?
When I was at the Malcolm Knapp Research Forest, my boss at the time, Paul Lawson, was actually one of the people in charge of the salvage logging operation in 2006 after the windstorm.
That's right.
Event, right?
That's right.
So Stanley Park has a history of disturbance events.
That's right. That's right.
Which a lot of Vancouverites maybe have forgotten over the years.
I guarantee you they've forgotten it. And in fact, the funny thing is I've asked a bunch of people if they could actually tell me if anything had seriously happened to that park in the past 20 years. Yeah. And most people would say no. And it's because it's a dynamic coastal temperate rainforest ecosystem that responds to disturbance very quickly. And these types of disturbance are common in that type of ecosystem. So the stuff that remains behind will fill in those gaps very quickly. It'll be done. Salmonberries will be in there, elderberries will be in there, and anything that might look like a stump or a dead tree is soon not going to be even noticeable. And then very shortly after that, all the young trees will begin to move into the gaps and grow up into the canopy. It's a matter of just sort of embracing nature for what nature does.
Yeah.
And time's a big element in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone that's interested in forest management and forestry in general? what would you say is the most enjoyable part about your job
Yeah.
at UBC,
yeah.
teaching forestry, teaching forest management practices, teaching forest entomology? What would you say to someone that's in maybe a high school student or even someone younger that's interested in getting into the industry and the research?
Well, I mean, I often say, sort of a little bit tongue in cheek, that I love my job because I effectively get paid to walk around in the woods and think. And really, I do in a lot of respects. Have a lot of that sort of opportunity to be outside and be in the woods, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I like being outside. The opportunities to do what I do are not so common, but there are other sources of either research, if that's what you're interested in, such as the federal research scientist positions, and the research support, research opportunities with the province, with private agencies as well. So there are those, but there's other really interesting opportunities that arise simply from the practical side of forestry in terms of forest management, which get you out there, get you in the woods, get you experiencing nature and what it's all about. A lot of the general public doesn't necessarily realize that we in the forest industry and forestry as a sort of an overall activity is mandated by law to be sustainable, right? Which means that in terms of harvesting, we cannot harvest more than what grows each and every year. Yeah. That's what a sustainable harvest sort of plan and an annual allowable cut means. Yeah. And it means that when things like a mountain pine beetle outbreak happen or a big fire happens, it means that the next year, the annual allowable cut has to be adjusted to accommodate the fact that the trees we expected to cut are no longer there. And that's how we remain sustainable. And that's at the heart of everything that is done in terms of forestry, right? So if you get into forestry from the point of view of wanting to be in the applied aspects and in terms of forest management, then everything that you're doing is going to be done in a way that you're going to attempt to achieve the sustainability, attempt to meet all of our goals in terms of diversity and diversification. I've never met a company forester, for example, who has been the type of person that you would think would want to clear cut everything. Right. Company foresters are motivated by their intent to do a good job and be responsible to the public in a way that actually produces, a sustainable ecosystems.
And a sustainable product.
And
we'll use every day.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So I think, from the point of view of the general public, forestry and forest management is an opportunity to be in the woods, if that's what you like to do, doing really sort of interesting things personally, but also an opportunity to be a real big contributor to the overall society, given that we sort of live in a big forest. We want this forest to persist. We want to be sustainable, and we want to have these ecosystem process or services that we depend upon into the future. So I think it's a great job. Yeah.
I'm sure over the course of your career, you've seen a lot of changes in what's available in terms of technology. So can you speak to that a little? Like, I'm sure the just the computer system, the GIS, the remote sensing, the LiDAR technology that's available now is just incredible compared to what it was 20 years ago.
It really is. It really is. I'll give you an example. So recently, working with a postdoctoral fellow, he and I took some machine learning tools, so basically some AI, and used it to help us model expectations of Western Swiss bloodworm outbreaks. And we built this model and we applied it to the past and asked how well it could explain things. And we were actually correct in predicting the space and time of outbreaks by about 94%. Wow. So it was astonishing. And what we were trying to do was use these machine learning techniques to embrace a bit of biology and then sort of tell us what the potential predictability was on the other side of things. So there's that. And you're right. We've got remote sensing and all these various tools that we use for looking at the forest. Those are becoming more and more relevant to ecological questions because we can sort of say to the remote sensors, what can you see for us over the bigger landscapes? And can we bring them into our understanding of ecological phenomena? I worked with a colleague at UBC recently where we actually used drones with LiDAR to look at fuel loading after mountain pine beetle impacts. So it's really coming a long way and giving us new insights into every aspect, for sure.
One of the key things that I have in my questions here is the word collaboration. And how would you define that subject in your career, and more importantly, sort of the collaboration between academia and forest management? And I think sometimes there can be it's a tough thing to communicate
Yeah.
what academics like yourself are learning, the research you're doing, and how that relates to the on the ground forestry work being done. So speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And in the context of academia and the colleagues I have at UBC, the interesting thing is that the breadth of experience and expertise there is such that I tend to be in a bit of a minority. There aren't many of us that sort of work on the ground in the context of sort of North American, Canadian, British Columbia issues, because we've got lots of people that are involved in tropical forestry, for example, and international forestry issues, and so on and so forth. The social sciences aspect of forestry as well. All of that is wonderful, and we need that. But there's a fewer of what I would call me available, that are sort of likely to interact directly, say, with a company or with a provincial forest management group. But there are some of us, and those interactions are pretty critical and not always easy, and unfortunately, they tend to be very organic. So in other words, I will go around with some ideas, attempting to sort of implement them through maybe some sort of grant that requires the cooperation and collaboration of an industry partner. And basically, I go to the partner who's interested, and obviously not to the ones who are not interested. So I've worked a lot with different industry partners and collaborators, and we've had wonderful success at doing things. But in my case, it's actually been largely in Alberta where I've been doing this work, because they have been very open and receptive to the type of science that I've been working with, and they've been actually quite, clamoring, given the mountain pine beetle had arrived there, for input for science to help them manage the thing. So it's organic, and really the downside of the organic relationships means that they sort of crop up willy-nilly where the opportunities arise and don't necessarily sort of function everywhere, perhaps, that they should. So I would love to see more scientists working with some more local context, and I would love to see a greater bit of receptivity on part of all people that are involved in forestry to build these collaborations and not necessarily have them occur so randomly in the way that they seem to occur.
Yeah. Well, and a question that we're asking everyone in this podcast series is the word forestry, and you've obviously grown up in a community where forestry is important. But what does forestry mean to you?
Well, forestry has been the source of my livelihood. My father worked in a pulp mill for his entire career. It's been the source of my inspiration, mainly to improve it. To basically take what is a necessary aspect of our West Coast culture, our Western Canadian culture, and make sure that it persists in a sustainable way, so that I have the old growth forest to walk through, that I have the lake or the river to fish in, or the trails to ride my mountain bike and motorcycle on. Those are things that are meaningful to me, and forestry gives me those opportunities. But forestry has to be done in a way to ensure that those opportunities remain. So it's both opportunity and desire to ensure a long-term opportunity.
Yeah. And I think everyone has that connection to the to the word forestry, and if not, everyone we've asked that question to so far has had a similar answer. It's not just about the public perception of forestry can be so far different from those people that know the industry and are invested in it. Allan, thank you very much
thanks,
for being part of the podcast. This is a personal one for me and very important, and I really appreciate your time. And this home here was actually somewhere that you and your wife welcomed me into. So that was, you were very, very kind to me, and I really, really appreciate that. So, thanks for being a part of the podcast. This is episode 3, and
nice.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so thrilled that you're here, and I'm thrilled we get a chance to talk, and let's do more of it going forward.
Yeah. And to all our listeners out there, this is expert forest entomologist. So there you go, right there.
Yeah, bugs and trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's nice. Thanks.
So cheers. Yeah.